the world was a symphony of chaos. Once vibrant fields, now scarred and barren. Villages, once alive with laughter and song, lay in ruins, haunted by silence. The sky, once a canvas of blue, was choked with smoke, a grim testament to the ceaseless barrage of artillery fire. War had cast its long, dark shadow upon the land. The front line snaked through the heart of the land, a jagged scar of trenches and fortifications. On either side, young men huddled, their faces grim, their eyes hardened by the horrors they had witnessed. Before the war, the two nations had been as close as brothers, their histories intertwined, their cultures blended, their people bound by ties of kinship and shared traditions. They had traded together, celebrated together, mourned together. Merchants crossed borders freely, their caravans laden with spices and silks, stories and songs. Students flocked to each other's universities, eager to learn from different perspectives, to broaden their horizons. Lovers whispered promises across the river that divided them, their hearts oblivious to the artificial boundaries that separated them. Propaganda posters, plastered on crumbling walls, screamed accusations and stoked the flames of hatred. They spoke of treachery and betrayal, of enemies at the gates, of the need to fight for freedom, for survival. Fear and suspicion poisoned the hearts of men, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. The bonds of kinship, once unbreakable, frayed and snapped under the immense pressure of war. The war had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a monstrous entity that fed on the hatred it engendered. It demanded sacrifice, loyalty, and blind obedience. But as the days bled into weeks and the weeks into months, doubts began to gnaw at their resolve. Elias had been born with dirt under his nails and the scent of hay in his hair. He grew up in a small village nestled amongst rolling hills, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons, the rising and setting of the sun. His world had been small, but it had been filled with the simple joys of life on the land. He had learned to plow the fields before he could read, his small hands gripping the worn wooden handles of his father's plow. He knew the feel of rich soil beneath his fingers, the satisfaction of watching seeds sprout and grow into golden wheat under the summer sun. The war had first touched Elias's life through the letters his older brother Thomas sent home from the front. The letters arrived irregularly, stained with mud and the grime of war, their once neat handwriting now hurried and uneven. They spoke of long marches, of sleepless nights spent huddled in muddy trenches, of the constant fear that gnawed at their souls. Elias would sit by the fireplace, his mother beside him, her face pale and drawn, as his father read the letters aloud. Then, one day, the letters stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy blanket of dread settling over their small cottage. His mother, unable to bear the uncertainty, clung to the hope that Thomas was simply missing in action, that he would one day stumble back to them, weary but alive. But Elias, even at his young age, sensed the truth. He saw it in his father's haunted eyes, in the way his mother's shoulders slumped with each passing day, in the hushed whispers that followed him like shadows. His brother, the boy who had taught him to ride a horse, who had always protected him from bullies, was gone. He joined the army, not out of a sense of patriotism or duty, but out of a desperate need to make sense of the senseless, to find some semblance of justice in a world that seemed to have forgotten its meaning. He carried the weight of his brother's memory on his shoulders, a heavy burden that fueled his every step. He threw himself into training, his body hardening, his resolve solidifying with each passing day. He learned to handle a rifle, to march in formation, to suppress the fear that gnawed at his insides. Across the battlefield, hidden in the trenches of the opposing side, was Luca. Unlike Elias, Luca wasn't a stranger to the world beyond his village. Books with their worn spines and the scent of aged paper had been his companion since he was a child. He was a dreamer, his head always buried in a book, his mind wandering through fantastical realms conjured up by words. He devoured stories of valiant knights and wise wizards, of faraway lands and forgotten civilizations. His world, unlike Elias's, wasn't bound by the physical limitations of his small village. Luca's mother, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering love, encouraged his thirst for knowledge. She would often sit with him in the evenings, listening patiently as he read aloud to her, his voice filled with the wonder of discovery. She recognized in him a spark, a potential that extended far beyond the confines of their small village. His parents, despite their modest means, scraped together enough money to send him to the city to continue his education. It was a bittersweet parting, filled with tears and promises to write often. Luca, armed with his books and a heart full of hope, boarded the train to the city, eager to embrace the world that awaited him. The war, when it came, shattered Luca's carefully constructed world. It arrived like a bolt from the blue, a storm that swept away the tranquility of his academic pursuits, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty and fear. The news arrived in a flurry of telegrams and frantic whispers, each message a hammer blow to his heart. The city, once a vibrant hub of intellectual discourse, transformed into a cauldron of fear and paranoia. Students, once united by their shared thirst for knowledge, were now divided by the invisible lines of nationalism and suspicion. The war had seeped into their sanctuary, poisoning their minds, turning friend against friend. Luca, a pacifist at heart, watched in horror as his world crumbled around him. At the train station, surrounded by a sea of uniforms, Luca witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of war. Families torn apart, mothers weeping for sons they might never see again, young men bidding farewell to loved ones, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and bravado. The air was thick with unspoken grief, a collective sense of dread that hung over the platform like a shroud. He finally managed to board a train, crammed into a carriage with dozens of other passengers. The journey was long and arduous, the air thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the stale aroma of cheap tobacco. Luca, surrounded by strangers, felt a profound sense of isolation, his books offering little comfort in the face of such overwhelming despair. Luca, despite his pacifist beliefs, knew he couldn't escape the clutches of war. He bid farewell to his parents, their tearful goodbyes echoing in his ears as he joined the ranks of young men marching off to fight a war they didn't understand, for reasons that seemed increasingly obscure. He found himself thrust into a world of mud, blood, and endless drills, his days consumed by the brutal routine of military training. The books he had once cherished, his companions in solitude, were replaced by a rifle, its cold, metallic weight a constant reminder of the task ahead. Luca, the scholar, the dreamer, struggled to reconcile his gentle nature with the brutal realities of war. He wrote letters to his parents whenever he could, his words filled with love and longing, but carefully omitting the horrors he witnessed, the fear that gnawed at his soul. He received letters from his former classmates, their words echoing the chaos and confusion of a world at war. Some had embraced the nationalistic fervor, their letters filled with tales of glory and vengeance. Others, like Luca, expressed their doubts, their disillusionment with a conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. Section 6. The Price of Silence. One letter, from his closest friend, arrived torn and stained, the ink smudged with what looked like blood. His friend, a talented artist who had dreamed of filling the world with beauty, had been killed in action. The news hit Luca like a physical blow, the weight of his friend's absence crushing him with its finality. In that moment, surrounded by the deafening silence of his grief, Luca understood the true cost of war. It wasn't measured in casualties or territorial gains, but in the shattered dreams of a generation, the silencing of voices that had so much to offer the world. His friend's death became a turning point for Luca, He continued to perform his duties, his movements precise, his actions efficient, but his heart was no longer in it. He carried with him the weight of his friend's memory, a constant reminder of the futility of war, the senseless loss it inflicted upon the world. He began to see his fellow soldiers, not as enemies, but as individuals, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories of love, loss, and sacrifice. Section 1. A chance encounter. The battle raged around them, a deafening symphony of destruction. Artillery shells screamed overhead, their explosions tearing jagged holes in the earth. Machine guns chattered incessantly, their bullets kicking up dust and splintering wood. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder, a choking haze that obscured the already blurred line between friend and foe. Elias, his face grimed with dirt and sweat, crouched low in his trench, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. His eyes, narrowed against the smoke, scanned the desolate landscape in front of him, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the enemy that lurked just beyond the barbed wire entanglements. He had lost track of how long they had been pinned down in this godforsaken trench. Hours, days. Time seemed to melt away in the heat of battle, replaced by an endless cycle of fear, adrenaline, and bone-deep exhaustion. He was surrounded by the familiar sounds of war, the groans of the wounded, the shouted orders, the constant chatter of gunfire. Yet, through the cacophony, he thought he heard something different. A faint cry, muffled by the wind, that seemed to come from the direction of the enemy lines. He strained his ears, listening intently, his heart pounding in his chest. There it was again, a little closer this time, a desperate plea for help that sent a shiver down his spine. Section 2. Faces of the enemy. He hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. Was it a trick, a ploy to lure them into a trap? He had been taught to see the enemy as faceless monsters, devoid of humanity. But this cry, this desperate plea for help, it didn't sound like the voice of a monster. It sounded human, vulnerable, filled with a raw terror. It spoke of pain, of fear, of a shared mortality. He glanced at his sergeant, a grizzled veteran, but the man's face was a mask of indifference. He was too far gone to see anything other than the enemy in those desperate cries. But Elias, young and haunted, couldn't silence the voice of empathy. He made a decision to help, against everything he had been taught. No man's land. Crouching low, he edged his way out of the trench and into the nightmare landscape of no man's land. The ground was a churned-up mess of craters and barbed wire, littered with the debris of war-shattered rifles, helmets pierced by bullets, and the bodies of men who had fought and died on this desolate stretch of earth. The cries for help were getting closer now, guiding him towards his unknown destination. He moved with a mix of caution and urgency, his senses on high alert, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, a grim reminder of the ever-present danger. He spotted a figure lying crumpled amidst a tangle of barbed wire, their body illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby fire. He approached cautiously, his rifle raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. As he got closer, he could see it was an enemy soldier, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face contorted in pain. He was young, barely older than Elias himself, his eyes wide with fear and pain. He was clutching his leg, his hand stained crimson, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked up at Elias, his eyes pleading for mercy, his lips forming words that Elias couldn't understand. Trapped in the rubble. Elias lowered his rifle, his finger relaxing its grip on the trigger. He couldn't bring himself to shoot this helpless boy, this enemy who looked so much like his own fallen comrades. He approached cautiously, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. The young soldier flinched at his approach, his eyes darting nervously between Elias and the rifle he still held. Elias spoke softly, his voice barely audible above the din of battle, but the words meant nothing to the wounded soldier. They were divided by language, by culture, by the propaganda that had painted them as enemies. But in that moment, all that mattered was the shared language of pain, of fear, of a desperate hope for survival. Elias saw that the soldier was trapped, his leg pinned beneath a heavy piece of rubble. He knelt down, carefully examining the debris, his mind racing for a solution. He couldn't leave him here to die, but he also couldn't move the rubble on his own. He looked back towards his own lines, but they seemed miles away, the trenches nothing more than dark shadows in the flickering light of the flares. He knew it was too risky to call for help, that his own comrades might mistake his intentions and open fire. He was alone, caught in this nightmare landscape with an enemy soldier who was now his responsibility. The language of fear. He looked back at the young soldier, his eyes meeting the boy's fearful gaze. He pointed to the rubble, then to himself, then back to the rubble again, hoping to convey his intention to help. The soldier seemed to understand, a flicker of hope replacing the fear in his eyes. Elias carefully moved some of the smaller pieces of debris, his hands scraped and bleeding, his muscles screaming with exertion. The soldier winced with each movement, his breathing becoming more shallow, his face slick with sweat. Elias knew he needed to act fast, that time was running out. He took a deep breath, gathering his strength, and wedged his shoulder beneath the largest piece of rubble. He pushed with everything he had, his muscles screaming in protest, his vision blurring at the edges. Slowly, agonizingly, the rubble began to shift. The soldier cried out in pain, his body racked with tremors. But Elias didn't relent. He pushed harder, summoning a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength until, with a final grunt, he managed to dislodge the debris. He collapsed back onto the ground, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked at the soldier, who was now free, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his face pale with pain. Elias knew he couldn't leave him here, exposed and vulnerable in the middle of no man's land. He looked around frantically, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape for anything that could help. He spotted a discarded stretcher, half buried in mud, and dragged it over, his movements clumsy with fatigue. He gently lifted the soldier, ignoring his cries of pain, and laid him on the stretcher. He knew he couldn't get him back to his own lines, not without attracting attention. He had to get him to safety, to a place where he could receive medical attention. He looked towards the enemy lines, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance he could offer this young soldier who, just moments ago, had been his sworn enemy. He gripped the handles of the stretcher and, with a deep breath, began his perilous journey across no man's land. Two soldiers, united by a shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. Each step across no man's land was fraught with danger. The ground, littered with craters and twisted metal, seemed to shift beneath Elias's feet, threatening to swallow him whole. Flares erupted overhead, casting an eerie, flickering light on the desolate landscape, their brief illumination revealing the scattered bodies of the fallen, their forms frozen in grotesque poses. The injured soldier, his name unknown, his language foreign, moaned softly on the stretcher, his breath shallow and ragged, his body racked with tremors of pain. Elias, his own body aching with exhaustion, whispered reassurances, his words meaningless to the young man, yet carrying a weight of empathy that transcended language barriers. He pushed himself beyond the limits of his endurance, his mind numb, his body fueled by adrenaline and a desperate sense of purpose. The enemy lines, a dark scar on the horizon, seemed to draw no closer with each agonizing step. The silence of the night, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire and the soldiers' pained breaths, amplified his sense of isolation. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him, the knowledge that at any moment a sniper's bullet could end his mission of mercy, his life extinguished in a heartbeat. He thought of his brother, his face forever frozen in youthful innocence, a casualty of this senseless war. Was this how Thomas had died, alone in pain, far from home? The enemy lines loomed closer, a jumble of trenches and barbed wire entanglements that seemed to stretch endlessly in either direction. Fear, a cold fist clenching around his heart, urged him to turn back, to seek the relative safety of his own lines. But the soldier's labored breathing, a stark reminder of his responsibility, spurred him onward. He reached the first line of barbed wire, its sharp barbs glinting menacingly in the moonlight. He lowered the stretcher gently, careful not to jostle the injured soldier, and began the painstaking task of lifting and maneuvering the stretcher over and under the wire, his hands raw and bleeding, his uniform snagged and torn. He could hear voices now, muffled whispers carried on the night air, the clink of metal on metal, the sounds of soldiers going about their nightly routines, unaware of his presence just meters away. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. He risked a glance over the top of the barbed wire. 2 soldiers, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light, stood smoking cigarettes near the entrance to a dugout. They were talking in hushed tones, their laughter a jarring counterpoint to the ever-present tension that permeated the front lines. Elias ducked down, his mind racing. He couldn't risk being seen, not now, not when he was so close. He had to get the soldier to safety, to medical attention, before it was too late. He thought of the young soldier's pained breathing, his desperate plea for help that had echoed across no man's land, a universal language of suffering that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. He had to believe that compassion, like pain, transcended national borders, that these soldiers, his enemies, would recognize his act of mercy for what it was. He had to have faith in that shared humanity, that glimmer of hope that had sustained him through the darkest hours of this brutal conflict. Taking a deep breath, he hoisted the stretcher onto his shoulders and, with a silent prayer on his lips, pushed his way through a gap in the barbed wire, his movements slow and deliberate, his body tense with anticipation. He stepped into the enemy trench, the ground beneath his feet no different from the ground he had just crossed, yet feeling strangely foreign. The 2 soldiers, alerted by the sound of movement, spun around, their rifles raised, their faces illuminated by the sudden flare of a match. Elias froze, his heart pounding in his chest, the stretcher heavy on his shoulders. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the air thick with tension, the silence broken only by the crackling of the match as one of the soldiers lit his cigarette. They stared at him, their expressions unreadable in the flickering light. Elias met their gaze, his own face a mask of apprehension. He lowered the stretcher slowly to the ground, careful not to make any sudden movements. The injured soldier moaned softly, his body jerking with a spasm of pain. One of the soldiers, a tall, lanky youth with weary eyes, glanced down at the wounded man on the stretcher. He spoke in a low voice, his words unintelligible to Elias, but the tone was unmistakable. Concern. He bent down, examining the soldier's injuries, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up at Elias, his gaze lingering for a moment on the enemy insignia on his uniform, before turning back to his comrade. He spoke again, this time with more urgency, gesturing towards a nearby dugout. The other soldier, a burly man with a thick black beard, nodded curtly and disappeared into the darkness. Elias stood there, his body stiff with apprehension, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had crossed the line, breached the divide that had separated them for so long. He had placed his trust, his very life, in the hands of his enemies. And in that moment of uncertainty, surrounded by the darkness and the ever-present threat of violence, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed taking root in the barren wasteland of war. Minutes stretched into an eternity as Elias stood there, a silent statue in the heart of the enemy camp. He watched as the 2 soldiers carefully lifted their comrade onto a stretcher, devoid of animosity. He felt a hand on his shoulder and spun around, his body tense. But it was only the tall, lanky soldier, his eyes holding a strange warmth. He offered Elias a canteen, tilting it towards him. Elias hesitated, then accepted the drink. He saw the same exhaustion etched on their faces, the same longing for home. "Friend," he said finally, "you, friend." And in that moment of shared understanding, he found a truth that transcended the battlefield. He was led back to his lines under a flag of truce, the soldier's farewell echoing in his ears. He returned to a hero's welcome, his comrades slapping him on the back, their praise ringing hollow in his ears. He had seen the enemy not as monsters, but as men, young and afraid, fighting for a cause they may no longer believe in, just like him. The memory of that night, of the enemy soldiers' gratitude, of the shared canteen in the flickering light of a trench, stayed with him. It chipped away at the carefully constructed walls of hatred and fear, revealing the fragile hope that lay beneath. He began to see the world in shades of grey, the stark black and white of propaganda replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the human condition. The war raged on, claiming more lives, shattering more dreams, but Elias carried within him a flicker of hope, a belief in the possibility of peace. He knew that somewhere, on the other side of the battlefield, the soldier he had rescued was fighting his own battles, challenging his own perceptions, spreading his own seeds of hope. He imagined a day when the guns would fall silent, when the trenches would be filled with the laughter of children, when the land, scarred and broken, would bloom again with life. A day when former enemies would meet, not as strangers divided by lines drawn in the dirt, but as brothers, bound by their shared humanity and their unwavering belief in the power of peace. The war, a brutal scar on the face of humanity, would eventually end, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and broken dreams. But from the ashes of conflict, from the seeds of compassion sown in the heart of the battlefield, a new dawn would rise. A dawn of peace, built on a foundation of empathy, understanding, and the unwavering belief in the power of human connection to bridge even the deepest divides. If you believe in the power of peace and human connection, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of hope and unity